The cemetery in Northfield sat higher than the surrounding streets, as if it needed distance from the living. Grant Holloway preferred it that way. From the moment his black sedan rolled through the iron gates, the world he controlled loosened its grip on him. The noise fell away. The phone stayed silent. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully here. He told the driver to wait outside. He always did. Grant stepped onto the damp grass alone, the cold biting through the soles of his shoes. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and each step left a faint impression behind him, as if the earth itself was keeping score of his visits. He walked slowly, not because he needed to, but because he didn't want to arrive too quickly. Arrival meant acknowledgement. It meant standing in front of something he had never learned how to fix. The headstone came into view before he was ready. Gray. Simple. No title. No poetry. Just a name and 2 dates that still felt unreal even after all this time. Grant stopped a few feet away, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. White lilies. Fresh. Carefully chosen, though no one was there to see the effort. He knelt with difficulty, one knee sinking into the grass, the other refusing to bend without protest. Grant had spent years ignoring his body, trusting it to keep up the way his mind always had. Now even that trust felt misplaced. "I'm late," he whispered, though he had arrived exactly when he always did. His voice sounded strange here. Smaller. Less certain. Grant set the flowers at the base of the stone and rested his hand against the cool surface. The granite was slick with moisture. Cold enough to sting. He kept his palm there anyway, as if holding on long enough might transfer something meaningful between them. His shoulders shook once. Then again. The first sound that escaped him was sharp and involuntary, like air being pulled too fast through a narrow space. He pressed his forehead against the stone, eyes squeezed shut, breath hitching. This wasn't the crying that came with noise and spectacle. This was quiet, collapsing inward. The kind that left no room for pride. "I should have been there," he said softly. The words broke apart as soon as they left his mouth. I really thought there would be more time." The wind moved through the trees behind him, rustling leaves that hadn't yet fallen. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed. Life continuing. Grant stayed kneeling, unmoving, as minutes slipped past unnoticed. He didn't know he was being watched. Several rows back, partially hidden by a bare-limbed maple, a woman stood perfectly still. She wore a plain coat and sensible shoes, her hands folded tightly at her waist. She had stopped walking the moment she realized where she was, her feet refusing to take another step forward. She knew this place. She knew this ritual. She had seen him leave the house before, quiet and deliberate, thinking no one noticed. She hadn't meant to follow him. At least that's what she told herself. Curiosity, she said. Fresh air. Anything but the truth. From where she stood, she could see the back of his shoulders rise and fall. She could hear the soft, uneven rhythm of his breathing when the wind shifted just right. She could see his hand pressed flat against the stone, fingers spread as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. Her throat tightened. This wasn't the man she saw every day. Not the distant employer who moved through rooms without really entering them. Not the billionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines. This was just a father, bent under a grief that refused to age quietly. She should have turned around. She didn't. Grant finally lifted his head. His face was wet, his jaw clenched tight as if holding something back that no longer fit inside him. He drew in a slow breath and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, already rebuilding the walls that came so easily everywhere else. As he stood, he felt it. That sensation people got when they were no longer alone. He turned. For a brief, suspended moment, their eyes met across the rows of stone. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly masked by confusion, then something sharper. "I didn't realize anyone else was here," he said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. "I'm sorry," the woman replied quietly. I wasn't trying to intrude. He studied her, searching his memory. You work at the house? Yes, sir. The wind slipped between them, carrying the smell of wet leaves and cold earth. He glanced once at the headstone, then back at her. Then you know, he said. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Grant exhaled slowly. Most people don't want to see that. I didn't mean to, she said again, and this time it sounded like something closer to truth. He straightened his coat. You may go. She hesitated just for a second before turning away. As she walked back toward the path, her heart pounded hard enough to make her dizzy. Because she knew the name carved into that stone. And she knew there was more to this story than the man kneeling alone among the dead. If you're still here, stay with this story. Some moments don't reveal their meaning right away. And if you've ever carried a quiet grief of your own, you might recognize what comes next. Grant did not look back after dismissing her. He waited until the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, until the cemetery returned to its careful quiet. Only then did he allow his shoulders to sag. The moment she disappeared from view, the strength he had borrowed for appearances drained out of him. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the headstone as if it might say something new if he watched closely enough. It never did. The drive back to the estate felt longer than usual. Traffic lights blurred together. Familiar streets passed without registering. His mind replayed the moment he had turned and seen her standing there, still as stone, eyes locked on him with something he couldn't quite place. Not pity. Not curiosity. Recognition. That unsettled him more than the tears she had seen. At the house, the gates opened automatically, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as he pulled in. The building loomed ahead, clean lines, glass walls, perfectly maintained landscaping. Impressive from the outside. Hollow on the inside. Grant stepped into the foyer and paused, listening. The house made its usual sounds. A distant hum from the heating system. The soft tick of a clock he didn't remember choosing. Somewhere a vacuum shut off. She was here. He removed his coat slowly, hanging it on the hook by the door, then stood there for a moment longer than necessary. He told himself he was tired. That the cemetery always took something out of him. That the encounter meant nothing. But when he finally walked deeper into the house, his attention shifted without permission. Lenora moved through the living room quietly, gathering magazines from the coffee table. She hadn't changed. Same posture. Same controlled movements. She didn't look at him when he entered. Good afternoon, sir, she said, her voice even. Afternoon, he replied. The word landed between them and stayed there. Grant crossed to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it too quickly. His hand shook slightly as he set the glass down. He hated that she could see it. She pretended not to. For the rest of the day, they moved around each other like strangers sharing a public space. Grant took calls in his office, his voice calm and precise as always. Lenora cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in weeks, folding linens no one would use. Every now and then, Grant caught himself listening for her footsteps. He didn't know why. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay staring at the ceiling, the image of the cemetery replaying in fragments. The cold stone. The weight in his chest. And her, standing there, silent, witnessing something no one else ever did. He told himself it was a breach. An invasion of privacy. But another thought followed, quieter and more uncomfortable. She hadn't looked away. The next few days passed with a strange, deliberate distance. Grant adjusted schedules. Meetings ran longer than planned. He left early and returned late. When Lenora was assigned to clean near his study, he relocated to the city office without explanation. It wasn't avoidance, he told himself. It was professionalism. Lenora noticed anyway. She noticed because people who were truly indifferent didn't change their routines. She said nothing. She worked. She kept her head down and her expression neutral. But at night, lying in her small apartment, her mind wandered back to the cemetery again and again. She could still see him kneeling there. Still hear the way his voice broke. She had spent years teaching herself not to feel too deeply about other people's pain. Caring too much made things complicated, dangerous. But this wasn't something she could pack away neatly, because the name on that headstone wasn't just familiar. It was personal. Grant finally broke the silence 3 days later. He was in his study when he called for her, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it impossible to ignore. Lenora paused in the hallway, steadying herself before stepping inside. "Yes, sir?" He didn't look up right away. Papers were spread across his desk, though he wasn't reading them. "Close the door," he said. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Grant folded his hands together, resting them on the desk. "I've been thinking about what happened at the cemetery." Lenora said nothing. "You recognized her," he continued. "Not as my daughter. As someone you knew." Her chest tightened. She had expected this question, dreaded it, prepared for it in half-formed sentences that never quite worked. "I saw your face," he said. "That wasn't sympathy. That was familiarity." Lenora took a slow breath. "You're asking me something that doesn't have a short answer. I'm asking if you knew her." She met his eyes. "I knew her mother." Grant's jaw clenched. "That's not possible." "She lived in Indiana," Lenora said carefully. "For a time." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Grant stood abruptly, pacing once before stopping in front of the window. "You need to explain yourself." "I will," Lenora said. "But not like this." He turned back to her, disbelief flickering across his face. "You think you get to decide how this goes?" "No," she replied quietly. "I think the truth does." The words settled between them, unresolved and dangerous. Grant stared at her, realizing for the first time that whatever she knew had the power to fracture everything he thought he understood. And he had no idea how far back the fracture went. Lenora left the study with her pulse racing, the echo of Grant Holloway's stare following her down the hallway like a weight she couldn't shake. She kept her pace even, her posture straight, refusing to let the staff see anything unusual in her movements. Inside, though, everything felt loose and unsteady. She had crossed a line the moment she spoke about Indiana. Now there was no stepping back. She spent the rest of the afternoon working in rooms far from his study, her hands moving on instinct while her mind drifted. Dusting shelves, folding towels, straightening pillows that would remain untouched. The work grounded her, but only slightly. Every object in the house felt like it belonged to a life paused mid-sentence. In the guest wing, sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching on framed photographs that lined the corridor. Corporate events, charity dinners, ribbon cuttings. Grant Holloway smiling beside people whose names Lenora didn't know, whose faces blurred together in her memory. She stopped in front of one frame she hadn't noticed before. The girl again. Different photo this time. She stood between Grant and his former wife, holding each of their hands, her grin wide and unrestrained. Lenora's breath caught. She leaned closer without meaning to, studying the child's face as if it might change under scrutiny. It didn't. The familiarity hit her like a slow bruise. Lenora stepped back, her chest tight, and forced herself to keep moving. Standing there too long would raise questions. Questions led to conversations. Conversations led to truths she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Not yet. Grant watched the security feed long after Lenora left his study. He told himself it was routine, a habit, something to keep his mind occupied. But his gaze followed her path through the house with unsettling focus. He noted how she paused briefly in the hallway near the photographs, how her shoulders stiffened before she moved on. She knew something. That much was undeniable. The realization brought a flicker of anger, quickly followed by something else. Fear, perhaps. Fear that the story he had built around his daughter's life and death was incomplete. That there were pieces missing he had never thought to look for. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. His daughter had loved puzzles. She used to spread them out across the living room floor, carefully sorting pieces by color. When Grant stepped over them without paying attention, she scolded him gently, hands on her hips. "You have to see the whole picture," she'd say. Grant hadn't learned that lesson until it was too late. That evening, Lenora stayed later than usual. She volunteered to finish the laundry so the night staff could leave early. It was easier to be busy than to sit alone with her thoughts. The hum of the machines filled the small room, steady and comforting. She folded sheets slowly, smoothing out creases with deliberate care. The repetition helped her breathe. She hadn't planned on staying in this job so long. It was meant to be temporary. A way to save money, regain stability, move on. Instead, the house had pulled her in quietly, wrapping its grief around her until it felt almost familiar. She finished the last load and turned off the lights, pausing in the hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. Grant stood there, his tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm. He looked less like the man from boardrooms and headlines and more like someone who hadn't slept enough. "I didn't realize you were still here," he said. "I was finishing up," Lenora replied. A silence stretched between them, not as sharp as before but heavier somehow. "You said you knew her mother?" Grant said finally. Lenora nodded. He exhaled slowly. "How well?" "Well enough," she said. "To know she loved her child." Grant's jaw tightened. "That doesn't answer my question." "It's the part that matters most," Lenora replied. He studied her, frustration flickering across his face. "You're careful with your words." "I have to be." "Why?" Lenora hesitated. "Because once things are said, they don't go back to how they were." Grant let out a short, humorless breath. "You think they are now?" The question lingered. She didn't answer. That night, after Lenora left, Grant poured himself a drink he didn't finish. He stood in the darkened living room, staring at the reflection of the windows, the house mirroring itself endlessly. He thought about Indiana. About years he had trusted his wife to manage details he didn't want to deal with. About meetings he had prioritized over school events, conversations he had postponed. He had believed he was providing. Now he wondered what he had missed. Across town, Lenora sat on the edge of her bed, an old folder open in her lap. Inside were documents she rarely touched, hospital paperwork, dated and yellowed, names partially redacted but still legible if you knew what to look for. She traced a finger over one line and closed the folder quietly. Soon, she knew, it would no longer be enough to remember in silence. And when the truth finally surfaced, neither of them would be able to pretend the past was settled. The estate felt impossibly large when Grant returned the next morning. Sunlight spilled across the polished floors, bouncing off the glass walls, catching dust motes that danced like tiny specters in the golden light. The grandeur of the place, meant to impress, now only emphasized how empty it had become. There were rooms no one entered for weeks. Hallways echoing with footsteps that no one heard. Doors that hid stories behind them, stories Grant had long chosen not to think about. Lenora moved quietly through the house as usual, her presence almost invisible. She had learned early on that being seen too much was dangerous. Her eyes scanned rooms, straightened cushions, and dusted shelves without disturbing the careful equilibrium Grant had created. But even as she worked, her mind kept drifting back to the cemetery, to the weight of what she had witnessed, and what she had allowed to happen without speaking. Grant had already started his day in the study, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and legal documents. Numbers blurred past his eyes, but they couldn't drown out the echo of the child's laughter he remembered from long ago. She had loved to play piano, banging keys with abandon, grinning at him when he applauded, even when it sounded terrible. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black as always, and sipped it slowly, trying to calm the tension he could feel tightening in his chest. For weeks now, he had felt that tension growing, something unspoken hovering between him and Lenora. Something he couldn't name but could not ignore. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement in the hall. Lenora was walking past the study, her steps measured and soft. He didn't call her. He didn't want to. Not yet. But he noticed how she paused near the framed photographs lining the hallway, the same ones that always caught her attention. She straightened quickly when she realized he was looking, and moved on as if she hadn't lingered at all. Grant let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His mind drifted back to the cemetery again, the way she had been standing, observing silently, absorbing everything without interfering. It unnerved him. He wasn't used to people noticing things he didn't want noticed. And yet she had. The day passed with a fragile normalcy. Grant conducted his calls, attended meetings in the home office when necessary, and moved through the estate, checking each room with an almost obsessive care. Lenora moved alongside him, performing her duties quietly, never interfering, never intruding, but always there. It was late afternoon when he found himself standing in the library, a place he rarely used, staring at the spines of books he had never read. He was tired of the silence, of the weight pressing in on him. He remembered how she had spoken at the cemetery, the calmness in her voice, the recognition in her eyes. He wondered if she even realized how much she had seen, how much she had understood. He poured another cup of coffee and walked to the window, watching the shadows stretch across the manicured lawns. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and earth. He could hear her footsteps in the distance, carrying the rhythm of her work through the empty halls. And then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, Lenora appeared in the doorway. She stopped just inside, her hands folded in front of her, eyes steady. She did not speak. She did not move forward. She simply watched as if waiting for him to say something. Grant looked at her, his throat tight. "You were at the cemetery," he said, voice low. Not a question, not a statement. Something in between. "Yes," she replied simply. He sighed and leaned against the window frame. "You didn't have to be." "I know," she said. "But I was." The honesty in her voice made him swallow hard. He realized then that whatever this connection was, whatever she had seen, whatever she knew, it wasn't just about the past. It was about him. His guilt. His mistakes. His absence. He wanted to ask her how much she understood. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that he had been doing his best in a world that didn't allow perfection. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, a small gesture, almost invisible. Lenora gave a slight incline of her head and turned, moving back into the hallway. Grant watched her go, feeling the strange pull of curiosity and unease in equal measure. He didn't know what she knew. He didn't know what she would do next. But he knew one thing with certainty: nothing in the house would ever feel the same again. And as the wind shifted outside, rustling the leaves like a whisper, Grant felt a quiet, uncomfortable certainty that this was only the beginning. Something was coming. Something neither of them could ignore. For a moment, he allowed himself a thought he hadn't admitted to anyone in years. Maybe he didn't have control over this house or this story anymore. And he wasn't sure if that terrified him, or if it was exactly what he needed. Lenora had learned to move quietly through the estate, but that morning she lingered a little longer than usual in the hallway outside the guest wing. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes and making them sparkle like tiny stars suspended in the air. She paused, hands resting lightly on a railing, and let herself breathe for a moment. Her eyes drifted to a photograph that she hadn't noticed before. It sat on a side table, framed in polished wood, angled so it caught the light. She approached it without thinking, drawn by a quiet pull she didn't fully understand. The image was of a little girl, probably 7 or 8, standing between Grant and his former wife. The child's grin was wide, unrestrained, full of the careless joy that came from knowing she was loved. Her hands clutched each of her parents, and for a moment, Lenora could almost hear her laughter echoing across the empty halls of the estate. Lenora's fingers hovered above the frame. She had seen that face before. Not in this house, not in these photos. She had seen it in her mind, in fleeting memories she had tried to bury, in dreams that never let her rest. Her chest tightened, and for a moment the air felt too thin to breathe. She quickly stepped back, afraid that she had lingered too long. No one had noticed, but what she had felt was impossible to ignore. The photograph was more than just an image. It was a reminder, a connection, and a challenge all at once. Lenora returned to her work, moving through the rooms methodically. She dusted shelves, folded towels, straightened pillows. The physical rhythm helped calm her racing mind. But every task reminded her of something else. The time she had spent apart from her own child, the decisions she had been forced to make, the secrets she had carried for years. Meanwhile, Grant moved through his morning with the precision of someone used to controlling everything around him. Meetings, calls, schedules. Every gesture, every command carefully measured. Yet even he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension building in the house. Something had shifted since the cemetery. Something invisible but undeniable. At one point he paused near the hallway where Lenora had been. He watched her move, careful, deliberate, almost invisible. He noticed how her gaze had lingered near the photographs, how she straightened quickly when she thought he might see her. That moment had unsettled him, though he didn't understand why. By mid-afternoon, Lenora found herself in the library, a room she rarely entered. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with books that seemed more decorative than useful. She ran her fingers along the spines absent-mindedly, letting her mind wander back to Indiana. Back to the hospital room she had left behind, the life she had tried to rebuild, the child she had not been able to keep. A folded folder lay forgotten on a table. Yellowed papers peeked out from the edges. Lenora recognized the documents immediately. Old hospital records, adoption papers, timelines carefully preserved. She picked it up, careful not to disturb the rest of the room, and flipped through it slowly. Each page pulled memories she had worked so hard to lock away. Names, dates, faces, all pointing to a life that had intersected with the Holloways in ways she had never anticipated. She traced her finger along one line, pausing to let the information sink in. The truth she had held quietly for so long was no longer safe in the shadows. And just as she closed the folder, footsteps echoed from the hallway. She stiffened, heart pounding. Grant appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, jacket slung over his arm. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, eyes sharp, calculating, unreadable. "I didn't realize you were still here," he said finally, voice steady but quiet. "I was finishing up," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. A tense silence stretched between them. The room felt smaller than it was, the tall shelves pressing in like witnesses. "You said you knew her mother?" he said, careful now. Lenora nodded. "I did." His jaw tightened. "How well?" "Well enough to know she loved her child," she said softly. Grant exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "That doesn't answer my question." "It's the part that matters most," Lenora replied, and for a moment neither of them moved. He studied her, frustration flickering across his features, but there was something else too, something he hadn't expected, a quiet authority, an unshakable calm that unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. "You're careful with your words," he said at last. "I have to be," she replied. "Why?" "Because once things are said, they don't go back to how they were." Grant leaned back against the edge of a shelf, the weight of her statement sinking into him. He let the silence linger, realizing she was right. Words had power. Truth had consequences. And some truths were dangerous. Lenora turned and left the room, leaving him standing there with the folded folder and the faint smell of dust and old paper lingering in the air. As she moved down the hallway, her mind raced. She knew the conversation had only just begun. She knew the next step would change everything, for both of them. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees against the house. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between footsteps and whispers, both of them sensed that the story they had been living in silence was about to collide with the past in ways neither could fully anticipate. The house was quieter than usual that afternoon. Even the distant hum of the air conditioning seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Lenora moved through the rooms with practiced care, dusting shelves and folding towels, but her mind was elsewhere. The photograph of the little girl, the folder she had glimpsed yesterday, it all lingered in her thoughts, tugging at memories she had buried long ago. There were rules in the Holloway estate. Unspoken ones that the staff obeyed instinctively. Certain rooms were never entered. Certain subjects were never mentioned. And above all, the child was off limits. No one talked about her, no one asked questions, no one let themselves feel anything about the loss that had clearly shaped the house in ways no one could see. Lenora had learned those rules quickly. She had been careful, silent, almost invisible. But the encounter at the cemetery had broken something. Something inside her that refused to stay buried. She had seen Grant Holloway kneeling at the headstone, vulnerable in a way no one else was allowed to witness. She had heard the unsteady catch of his breath, the soft whisper of words meant only for the earth beneath him. And she had seen him, a man the world considered unbreakable, crumble entirely. The memory haunted her as she walked past the family portraits lining the hallway. Grant's former wife smiled in every picture, the little girl between them grinning like the world was hers. Lenora stopped at one frame, her hand hovering over it for a moment before moving on. She had to focus on her duties. She had to keep the house in order, even if her mind was spinning. Grant, meanwhile, was in his office, sitting behind the massive desk that seemed to separate him from the rest of the world. He ran his fingers along the edge of the polished wood, his thoughts circling the same point over and over. Something had shifted since the cemetery. Something he couldn't name, but felt in every glance, every movement, every silence. He remembered her standing there, quiet, watching him without interfering. She hadn't flinched, hadn't turned away. She had been present in a way few people ever were. And it unnerved him. Because he had no idea how much she had understood, how much she had seen, and how much of the past she carried with her. By evening, Lenora found herself in the guest wing, arranging linens with slow, deliberate care. The hum of the washing machines in the background was steady, almost comforting, giving her a rhythm to follow while her thoughts wandered back to Indiana. Back to the hospital, the child she had held for an hour, the papers she had signed with trembling hands, the life she had been forced to give up. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. A message from her sister. "Are you okay?" Lenora stared at it for a moment, then put it aside. The question felt almost laughable. How could she explain that she was fine on the outside while her past had resurfaced in the house of the man whose grief mirrored her own? She folded the last towel and carried it down the hall when she noticed a faint light in the library. Grant's office was across the corridor. He was there, of course, working late as usual. But the library, he rarely used that room. She paused, curiosity flickering. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old paper and polish. She moved closer to the window, catching a glimpse of him through the glass wall. He was seated in a chair, head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, a glass of untouched water on the table beside him. His tie was loose, his jacket draped over the arm of the chair. Lenora's chest tightened. This was the man who had built empires, controlled millions, and yet here he was, seemingly suspended in exhaustion, consumed by thoughts that no one else could touch. She wanted to turn away to leave him in peace, but she couldn't. Not yet. For a moment, they existed in parallel worlds, she in the hall, he in the chair, connected by grief and silence. She thought about the rules of the house, the unspoken boundaries everyone followed. And she realized something. The rules didn't matter anymore. Not when the truth was so close, waiting to surface. Grant opened his eyes suddenly, and for an instant, it felt as if he knew she was there. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But something passed between them, a recognition of shared tension, of the weight each carried, of the unspoken knowledge that the past was not done with them yet. Lenora stepped back, heart pounding, and continued her work as if nothing had happened. but the air between them had changed. The house, the corridors, the photographs, they all felt charged with possibility and danger. Something was coming. Something inevitable. And neither of them knew how much of the past would be revealed tonight, or how far the truth would reach before the next sunrise. The morning air in Northfield was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant rain. Lenora had already completed her usual rounds in the house, but something tugged at her, a restless impulse she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was curiosity, a simple desire to understand, but deep down she knew it was more. She noticed his absence first. Grant Holloway was gone, leaving only the faint hum of the house behind. The front door had shut with that heavy, controlled click that always made her pause. Something in her gut told her he hadn't just stepped out for a walk. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes, echoing lightly in the quiet street. The neighborhood was empty, suburban streets lined with neatly kept lawns and houses that looked like postcards. Lenora followed instinct rather than thought, the familiar rhythm of her steps mixing with the tension that made her chest tighten. She spotted the black sedan first, parked inconspicuously at the edge of the street. Grant was walking ahead of her, shoulders straight, hands stuffed in his coat pockets. He didn't look back. He never did when he was on one of these walks. Lenora hesitated, fighting the impulse to turn around. She shouldn't follow him. She shouldn't intrude. And yet she couldn't help herself. Something about the way he moved, so alone and deliberate, compelled her to keep pace. The walk took them out of town, past familiar streets and into quieter roads where houses thinned and trees began to dominate the landscape. The hum of traffic faded. All that remained was the whisper of wind through branches and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Grant finally slowed as they approached the cemetery. Lenora ducked behind a maple tree, her heart hammering. She watched him from a distance, careful to stay out of sight. He stopped at the edge of the row where the grave waited. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and earth that had been turned too recently. Grant's movements were deliberate, kneeling, placing his hand on the cold stone, arranging the lilies with a precision that suggested ritual more than mourning. Lenora's throat tightened. She had seen grief before, distant and performative, but this was something raw, impossible to hide. He pressed his forehead against the stone, whispered words she couldn't catch, shuddered once, then twice. And she understood. This wasn't a man hiding behind wealth or power. This was a man undone by something that no amount of money or influence could fix. For a long moment, Lenora stayed frozen, watching, feeling the strange pull of connection without permission. Her mind raced with memories she had long tried to suppress. Names, places, promises she had made and broken. The child he grieved wasn't just his. In a way, she had a claim on that grief too. Grant's voice broke through her thoughts. "I should have been there," he whispered, soft and jagged. I really thought there would be more time." The words pierced her heart. She took a small step forward, but the crunch of leaves under her foot betrayed her presence. Grant's head snapped up. His eyes, sharp and clear, searched the rows of gravestones before landing on her hiding spot. Their eyes met. For a suspended moment, there was no recognition, no words, only the weight of what had been seen and what had been kept silent. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, voice low but firm. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, stepping out slowly. Grant studied her. He didn't smile. He didn't scold. He simply looked at her, the raw edges of grief and authority colliding in his gaze. "You know," he said, "most people never come here. Most people wouldn't want to see it. Wouldn't understand." I understand more than you think," she said quietly. For a moment, he seemed to weigh her words, deciding if they were truth or empty comfort. Finally, he exhaled, shoulders tightening as if bracing for a storm he couldn't control. "You may go," he said. Lenora nodded, heart still pounding, and stepped back into the shadows of the trees. She wanted to ask questions, to reach out, to speak, But she didn't. Not yet. As she made her way back toward the road, she realized something that chilled her. She had crossed the line today. She had witnessed something private, something no one else could ever see. And whatever happened next, there was no turning back from what she now knew. The cemetery remained behind her, silent and indifferent. But the weight of what had happened there followed her, pressing on her chest, making every step home feel heavier than the last. Grant didn't return to the house immediately after the cemetery. Instead, he lingered on the gravel path, letting the chill wind cut through his coat as if it could slice away the knot in his chest. Every nerve in his body had been alert the moment he saw her among the trees, standing perfectly still, watching him without flinching. He hadn't expected recognition. Not from anyone, and certainly not from a maid he barely noticed beyond her duties. Yet there she was, unafraid and unmoving, the quiet weight of her presence pressing down on him more than any visitor ever could. He turned slowly, pretending to scan the gravestones, but his eyes never left her. Lenora didn't move. She didn't look away. She simply observed, breathing shallowly, hands clasped together at her waist. He caught the flicker of something familiar in her gaze, an understanding that unsettled him, deep and unspoken. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, voice low, but steady enough to carry across the distance. Lenora hesitated. She had rehearsed what she might say in the car on the way over, in the small kitchen of her apartment last night. Nothing had prepared her for this. The rawness of his grief, the quiet authority even in sorrow, it rooted her to the spot. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said carefully. He studied her, tilting his head slightly. There was something almost imperceptible in the way he regarded her, like he was measuring the weight of her presence. "Most people don't come here," he said after a long pause. "Most people can't." I can," she replied softly, stepping just a little closer, though she remained in the shadow of the trees. Her voice was calm, but inside, her heart was hammering. "I've seen enough loss to understand some of it." His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. "You shouldn't understand this," he said. "Not yet. Not without knowing what it costs." Lenora felt the pull of his words, the unspoken warning that she was stepping into territory no one survived unscathed. She swallowed hard. Maybe I already know some of the cost," she said, voice barely above the rustling leaves. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. A crow cawed in the distance, startling them both. Grant exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. He turned back to the headstone, brushing his hand over the smooth granite, lingering on the engraved name. "You may go," he said finally, not looking at her. His tone was not angry but definitive. Lenora nodded. She knew better than to argue. But as she stepped back, her gaze lingered on him. There was so much he had not said, so much grief wrapped in that still form. A man who seemed to hold the world in his hands, yet here, kneeling among the dead, he held nothing at all. The path back to the road felt longer than she expected. Every step echoed in her mind, her thoughts looping over the image of him kneeling, the sound of his whispered apologies, the raw vulnerability she had witnessed. She realized she had crossed a line. One step and she was an observer. Another and she was implicated. She hadn't just watched a man mourn, she had seen the truth of what no one else ever saw. And that truth would not let her go. As she made her way home, a creeping sense of inevitability settled over her. Whatever this connection was, whatever secret lingered between them, it was no longer something she could ignore. And somewhere deep inside she knew the next time they spoke, nothing would be the same. The Holloway estate had a rhythm of its own, one that Lenora had learned to navigate effortlessly. Footsteps echoed softly along polished floors. The distant hum of appliances punctuated the quiet. Shadows stretched across the walls as the late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows. But today the rhythm felt off. Something in the air had shifted, and Lenora could feel it the moment she entered the house. Grant was already in the study, seated behind his desk, a stack of reports in front of him. His posture was straighter than usual, his eyes sharper, scanning papers with a focus that seemed almost performative. "Lenora," he said without looking up. "Yes, sir?" Her voice was calm, though her stomach had tightened. She had no idea what mood he was in. "Close the door," he said. She obeyed without hesitation, the soft click echoing louder than necessary in the quiet room. Once inside, she waited, hands folded, posture neutral as she had been trained to do. But she sensed that this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. Grant leaned back slightly, fingers steepled in front of him. "You've been distant these past few days," he said carefully. "I've been focused on my duties," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her mind raced. She knew he wasn't speaking about cleaning or organizing. He meant the cemetery. He meant the look she had given him when she had followed him. He finally looked at her, eyes narrowing just enough to unsettle her. "You followed me," he said, not accusing but stating the fact. Lenora's chest tightened. She had known this moment would come. I needed to understand," she admitted. "I needed to see." "You shouldn't have," he said, and his voice carried the weight of authority, grief, and frustration all at once. "Some things are private." "I know," she said softly. "But not everything can be hidden. Some truths have a way of finding us, whether we're ready or not." Grant let out a long, measured breath. "Do you understand what it means to stand there?" His voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. "To see me kneeling broken at my daughter's grave?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. She couldn't lie, not now. "I understand more than you think. I've seen grief too. I felt the weight of loss. You aren't alone in that." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to measure the depth of her words, to decide if she was telling the truth or simply repeating a well-learned line. Finally, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You know things you shouldn't know." "I know enough," she said carefully. "Enough to understand why you are the way you are. Enough to respect what you carry every day." Grant's jaw tightened. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for patience he didn't have. "Respect," he muttered. "Respect is earned, not given." "I understand that too," she said softly. "And I'm trying to earn it." A silence fell over the room, heavier than either of them expected. The faint tick of a clock, the hum of the air conditioner, and the soft rustle of papers on the desk were the only sounds. It felt like a standoff, but one that neither wanted to end hastily. Finally, Grant spoke. "You're curious," he said, more observation than accusation. "I am," she admitted. "And I need to know where the truth begins and where lies end." His eyes met hers, sharp and piercing, and for a moment, Lenora felt as though he could see everything she had tried to hide. The vulnerability he displayed in the cemetery had vanished behind the armor of the office, replaced with a scrutiny that was both unnerving and compelling. "Be careful," he said finally, voice low. "Curiosity can be dangerous." "I know," she said, stepping back toward the door. "But sometimes, it's the only thing that keeps us alive." He said nothing as she left the room, the soft click of the door echoing once more. Outside, Lenora paused for a moment, catching her breath. The house felt different now. Every corner, every shadow seemed charged with unspoken tension. She knew something had shifted, not just between her and Grant but in the house itself, because the truth was beginning to move. And once the past started to surface, neither of them would be able to ignore it. The rain began in soft, persistent taps against the windows, a gray curtain that muted the world outside. Lenora had been cleaning the guest wing, moving quietly between rooms, when a folded envelope slipped from between the pages of a book she was dusting. She picked it up, fingers trembling slightly, and saw Grant's neat, precise handwriting on the front. * Lenora, come to the study. There is something you need to see. *. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if the summons was a test, a warning, or something else entirely. But she followed it anyway, knowing that at some point, the line between observation and intrusion had already blurred. The study smelled faintly of leather and polish. Papers were stacked in neat piles, but one object caught her attention immediately, a small photo album placed deliberately in the center of the desk. Grant didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said, voice low. She obeyed, the chair cold beneath her hands. He poured himself a cup of coffee, untouched, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "This belonged to her mother," he said finally, nodding toward the album. "I've never looked at it in years. I thought it was better left forgotten." Lenora's fingers hovered over the edge of the album. She recognized the handwriting, the careful arrangement of images and dates. Her chest tightened. She didn't know if she should speak or stay silent. Grant opened the album, revealing photos of the little girl she had seen in the frames around the house. But here the images were more intimate. Birthday parties, first steps, quiet moments on the couch. The child laughing, crying, growing, captured in raw, unguarded ways. "You knew her mother well?" Grant asked suddenly, his voice sharper than before. "Yes," Lenora said softly, careful not to reveal too much too soon. "You didn't tell me," he said, eyes meeting hers. "You let me think she was a stranger." "I didn't want to complicate things," she admitted. "Not until I was certain you could handle it, or until I could." Grant leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Handle it?" he repeated. "You think I can't handle the truth?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just know the truth has power. It changes things. It doesn't just reveal, it unsettles, breaks, exposes." He stared at her in silence, as if weighing whether her words were truth or caution. Finally, he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "Show me," he said. For the next hour, Lenora and Grant worked together, opening the album, flipping through pages, recounting memories and stories she had barely shared with anyone. Her recollections of the mother, the quiet strength, the struggles, the unspoken sacrifices, blended with his fragmented memories of his daughter's life. And then came the first major revelation. One photograph fell from the album onto the desk. It was a candid shot of the little girl sitting in a hospital bed, smiling weakly, her hand clutching a small stuffed bear. Lenora's breath caught. The bear, she recognized it instantly. "That bear," Grant said, eyes narrowing. "Where did you—" Lenora swallowed. "It belonged to her mother's family," she said softly. "I kept it for her. I promised I would." Grant's hand shook slightly as he reached for the bear. The sight of it, so small, so fragile, so intimately tied to both her mother and his daughter, brought a lump to his throat. He realized then, with a painful clarity, that Lenora had been more than a passive observer in his life. She had been connected to it in ways he had never imagined. I didn't know," he whispered, voice barely audible. "You were part of her world." "Yes," Lenora said quietly. "I was, and I'm still here." The room fell into silence. The storm outside had grown louder, rain pelting the windows in urgent rhythm, matching the pounding of their hearts. Both of them understood that the past was no longer something to observe from a distance. It had arrived, fully, uninvited, demanding attention. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we have to decide what to do with this truth," he said finally, voice taut with tension. "Because once it's out, it changes everything." Lenora nodded, feeling the weight of their shared secret settle like a stone in her chest. For the first time, she realized that she and Grant were no longer merely master and maid, observer and observed. They were both bound to the same story, the same grief, the same fragile thread that tied the past to the present. And somewhere deep inside, both of them knew this was only the beginning. Grant didn't sleep that night. The house settled into its usual quiet after midnight, but his mind refused to follow. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the image of that stuffed bear replaying over and over in his thoughts. The way Lenora had recognized it. The way her voice had shifted when she spoke about keeping a promise. He had built his life on facts, contracts, timelines, evidence. But grief didn't follow logic, and neither did the truth that had surfaced in his study. By morning he was already dressed when the sun rose. He poured coffee and didn't drink it. He stood at the kitchen window and watched Lenora cross the yard, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She moved with the same quiet steadiness she always had, but now he saw it differently. Every step carried a history he hadn't known existed. When she entered the house, he was waiting. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lenora stopped where she was. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "I figured we would," she said. They sat across from each other at the small breakfast table, a place rarely used for anything serious. The domestic normalcy of it felt almost wrong, considering the weight pressing down on both of them. "You said you were part of her world," Grant began. "That doesn't happen by accident." Lenora nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't." "How?" he asked. "And why didn't I know?" She folded her hands in her lap, taking her time. "Because you weren't meant to," she said gently. "Not then." Grant's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision to make." "I know," she said. "But it was the only way I could survive it." He waited. "I met her mother years before you did," Lenora continued. "We worked together. Same hospital. Same night shifts. She was tired all the time, carrying more than anyone realized." Grant leaned forward slightly, his attention sharp. He had never heard this version of the story. The woman he'd loved had always shielded him from her exhaustion, her fear. "She didn't tell you everything," Lenora said softly. "Not because she didn't trust you, but because she didn't want to be seen as weak." Grant swallowed hard. "When the pregnancy got complicated, she was scared," Lenora went on. "Not just of the medical risks. She was afraid of disappearing, of becoming invisible." Grant's fingers curled into his palm. "She never told me that." "She told me," Lenora said, "because I didn't have anything to lose by hearing it." The words hung between them, heavy and sharp. "So you were there," Grant said slowly. "Through everything." "Yes." "And after?" Lenora hesitated. Just for a moment. It didn't escape him. "After," she said carefully, "things fell apart faster than anyone expected." Grant felt a tightening in his chest. "What aren't you saying?" She met his gaze, and this time she didn't look away. "You left," she said quietly. The words hit him harder than he expected. "I was working," he said automatically. "I know," Lenora replied. "You were trying to hold everything together. But while you were gone, she was alone. And when the complications came back, she didn't call you." Grant stood abruptly, pushing the chair back. "Why wouldn't she call me?" "Because she was afraid you'd choose the company over her," Lenora said, her voice steady but aching. "And because part of her already believed she had." The silence that followed was brutal. Grant turned away, pressing his hands against the counter. His reflection in the dark window looked older, smaller. "I never meant to," he said. "I know," Lenora replied. "But intention doesn't erase impact." He closed his eyes. Images flooded back. Missed calls, delayed flights, conversations cut short. He had told himself there would be time later. There was always later. "When she died," Lenora continued, "I stayed. Someone had to." Grant's breath caught. "You stayed with my daughter." "Yes." "For how long?" Lenora's voice softened. "Long enough to know her favorite stories. Long enough to know when she was pretending not to be afraid." Grant turned back to her, his eyes glassy. "Why didn't you tell me then?" "Because you were drowning too," she said. "And because I was afraid if you knew how much I loved her, you'd take her away from me." The confession settled heavily between them. Grant sank back into the chair, the fight draining out of him. For the first time, the pieces began to form a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't deny. "You weren't just watching me at the cemetery," he said quietly. "No," Lenora replied. I was mourning her too. The truth changed the air in the room. There was no anger left now, only the fragile understanding that grief had shaped them both in different ways. Grant looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something that unsettled him deeply. Lenora hadn't entered his life by chance. She had been orbiting it for years, unseen, carrying a piece of his past he had never known was missing. And the question that frightened him most wasn't what she had hidden. It was what else the past might still be holding back. The tension between them didn't dissolve after that conversation. It settled instead, heavy and watchful, like fog that refused to lift. Grant moved through the house with a new kind of awareness, noticing things he had ignored for years. The way Lenora straightened a picture frame but paused before touching the one with the little girl. The way she lingered near the back window at dusk, staring out as if expecting someone to appear. He told himself he was imagining it. That grief was rewriting his perception. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. Lenora was no longer just part of the staff. She was part of the story. Late that afternoon, Grant called his attorney. It was an old habit, reaching for legal clarity when emotions grew unruly. He asked for hospital records, adoption files, anything tied to the final months of his daughter's life. The request was precise, his tone controlled, but when he hung up, his hands were shaking. He went to the den and opened a locked drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents he had once skimmed and signed without reading closely. At the time, he trusted the professionals. Trusted that the system worked the way it claimed to. Now he wasn't so sure. Across the house, Lenora was in the laundry room, folding sheets with slow, deliberate movements. Every nerve in her body felt exposed. She had said too much. And yet she knew she hadn't said enough. There were truths she had guarded not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of reopening wounds. Fear of losing the fragile place she had carved out in this life. She heard Grant's footsteps before she saw him. "Lenora," he said from the doorway. She turned, heart thudding. "Yes." "There's something I need to ask you," he said. His voice was even, but his eyes weren't. They searched her face, alert now, no longer dulled by grief alone. She nodded once. "Ask." He hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. "After her mother passed," he said slowly, "there was a period I don't remember clearly. Meetings, travel, lawyers handling things I should have handled myself." Lenora said nothing. "During that time," he continued, "were there decisions made about my daughter's care that I wasn't fully aware of?" The room felt suddenly too small. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost oppressive. "Yes," Lenora said finally. Grant inhaled sharply. "What kind of decisions?" "Temporary ones," she said carefully. "At least that's how they were presented." "Temporary," he repeated. "To whom?" "To you eventually," Lenora said. "To others, maybe not." Grant stepped closer. "I need specifics." Lenora set the folded sheet down, her hands trembling now. "After the funeral, there was concern about stability. About your schedule. About whether a child that young should be moved from place to place." "I would never have abandoned her," Grant said, anger flashing through his grief. "I know," Lenora replied quickly. "But they didn't know you the way they thought they did. And your silence made it easier for them to decide for you." Grant's chest tightened. "Decide what?" "That she needed continuity," Lenora said. "Familiar faces. Familiar routines." "And that's where you came in," he said. She nodded. "I stayed with her. Nights, mornings, hospital visits. I was there when she woke up scared. When she asked for you and I didn't know what to say." Grant turned away, dragging a hand down his face. "Why wasn't I told?" "Because the paperwork said you agreed," Lenora said quietly. He spun back to her. "I never agreed to that." "I believe you," she said. "But your signature was there." The words landed like a blow. Grant felt something cold coil in his stomach. He thought of the drawer, the documents, the signatures he had rushed through while barely sleeping. Someone made decisions in my name, he said slowly. Yes, Lenora replied. And once they did, it was very hard to undo them. Silence stretched between them, sharp and dangerous. There's more, she added, her voice barely audible. Grant met her eyes. Say it. She wasn't just staying with me, Lenora said. Not officially. His breath caught. What does that mean? It means, she said, choosing each word with care, that her status was changed. Quietly. Temporarily, they said. Until you were ready. Grant's mind raced, pieces snapping together in ways that made his pulse roar in his ears. Changed how? Before she could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and felt the blood drain from his face. His attorney had sent a single message. Asterisk, I found something you need to see. We should talk in person. Asterisk. Grant looked up at Lenora, fear and fury colliding in his expression. What did they do to my daughter? He asked. Lenora opened her mouth to answer. And then the doorbell rang. Grant froze at the sound of the bell. It was sharp, insistent, cutting through the thick tension of the room. Lenora instinctively took a step back, her hands tightening on the counter as she followed his gaze to the front door. Neither of them moved immediately, both aware that whoever stood outside might carry the next piece of the puzzle that had been tormenting them for months. Grant's hand hovered over the lock, his jaw tight as he weighed whether to answer. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle, but the air felt charged, almost like electricity, heavy and expectant. Finally, he crossed the foyer in long, measured strides, each footfall deliberate. Lenora followed silently, careful not to intrude but unable to resist the pull of curiosity and fear. He opened the door, and the figure on the porch made him catch his breath. She was older than Lenora, dressed in a sharply tailored coat, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes calculating and unflinching. There was an air of authority in the way she carried herself, as if the world had taught her long ago that no one could stand in her way. Mr. Holloway, she said smoothly, voice clipped, we need to discuss the adoption records. There are discrepancies you should be aware of. Grant's stomach sank. Discrepancies. His voice was low, sharp, tinged with suspicion. Yes, she said, producing a thin folder from her bag. Documents that were altered. Signatures that were forged. And timelines that were deliberately manipulated to keep certain parties uninformed. Lenora felt her chest tighten. She had known there was more to uncover, but hearing it out loud made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. She glanced at Grant, whose hands were clenching into fists. The calm control he usually exuded was cracking, revealing a vulnerability that made her uneasy. Who did this? Grant demanded, voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. That's what we need to determine, the woman said evenly. But the trail leads to people you trusted. People inside the legal system. People who thought they were protecting the company, or themselves, by keeping the truth from you. Grant ran a hand down his face, then dropped it, breathing heavily. And my daughter? His voice broke. What happened to her? The woman paused, her eyes flicking briefly toward Lenora, as if gauging her reaction. She was placed in temporary care as intended, but there's evidence someone extended that period and made adjustments without your knowledge. Lenora's stomach turned. She had suspected some of this, but seeing it confirmed in the folder, hearing it from someone official, made her feel like the floor had dropped out beneath her. Grant's eyes locked on hers. Lenora, did you know about this? She shook her head quickly. No. I kept her safe, but I never touched the paperwork. I didn't sign anything. I didn't know what was being done behind the scenes. He exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the banister. God, he whispered. All this time. The woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood. I'm here to make sure it's rectified, she said. But it needs cooperation. Full transparency. Every document. Every signature. Every meeting. Otherwise, nothing can be corrected. Grant's shoulders tensed. He ran a hand through his hair, voice low and measured now. Then we'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes. Lenora reached out, her hand brushing his arm lightly. We'll get it right, she said softly, though her own voice trembled. The stakes were higher than either of them had imagined, and the past was catching up faster than they could process. The woman looked at them both, expression unreadable. Time is critical, she said. And the longer it takes to uncover everything, the more complicated this becomes. Grant nodded, his mind already racing through contacts, meetings, phone calls. The calculated precision he had always prided himself on was coming back into focus, fueled by grief and anger in equal measure. Lenora stayed close, silently observing, waiting for the moment he would let her help. Not as a maid, not as an outsider, but as someone who had already been entwined in his daughter's story in ways no one else could ever understand. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she realized that the first major twist wasn't the only one waiting to be revealed. There were still secrets, buried, dangerous, and capable of shattering everything they had begun to rebuild. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. The sound against the windows was relentless, a reminder that time was moving, consequences were waiting, and nothing in the Holloway estate, or their lives, would ever be the same again. Grant didn't bother with pleasantries after the door closed. He led the woman into the study, the same room where too many truths had already been dragged into the light. Lenora followed, lingering near the doorway, unsure whether she was invited or merely tolerated. No one told her to leave, so she stayed. The woman set the folder on the desk and opened it with practiced efficiency. Before we go any further, she said, you need to understand something. What happened wasn't a single decision. It was a chain. Grant leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. Start at the beginning. She nodded. After your wife passed, there was concern from multiple parties, your board, your legal team, even extended family, about instability. You were traveling constantly. Profits were volatile. Your grief was visible. Lenora felt Grant tense beside her. They framed it as protecting your daughter, the woman continued. Temporary guardianship. Temporary placement. Language designed to sound harmless. Grant's voice was sharp. And who signed off? That's where it gets complicated, she replied. Some signatures are yours. Others are not. Some dates don't line up. And some approvals came from people who no longer work for you. Grant's eyes darkened. Because they made sure they didn't. The woman met his gaze. Yes. Lenora shifted her weight. What kind of placement? She asked quietly. The woman glanced at her, measuring, then answered. A private medical-adjacent foster arrangement. Children with ongoing care needs. Not abusive, but detached. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Detached. The word sliced deeper than any accusation. She was sick, he said. She needed familiarity. Not strangers. That's not what the reports emphasized, the woman replied. They focused on efficiency. On minimizing disruption to your work. Grant let out a short, humorless laugh. My work. Lenora spoke again carefully. I was told it was temporary. That once things stabilized, she'd come home. The woman's pen paused over her notepad. Who told you that? Lenora hesitated. A case coordinator. She said she was acting on legal instruction. Grant's head snapped up. Name. Lenora swallowed. I never questioned it. I assumed. Assumed? Grant said the word tight. I assumed you knew, Lenora said, meeting his eyes. I thought you had made the decision. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The woman cleared her throat. There's something else. Grant didn't look away from Lenora. Go on. The placement was extended, she said. Quietly. Each time justification was added. Missed visits. Delayed responses. Professional travel. Grant's hands curled into fists. I visited when I was told where she was. Yes, the woman said. But not every visit was logged. Some requests never reached you. Lenora felt her chest tighten. I tried, she said softly. I kept asking when she was coming back. The woman's expression softened slightly. And that's where you become inconvenient. Grant turned to her slowly. What does that mean? It means, she said carefully, someone recommended reducing your access. Lenora's breath caught. Reducing. They framed it as emotional boundaries, the woman said. Too much attachment from non-family caregivers. Grant stared at Lenora now, something raw and furious breaking through his restraint. They cut you out. Lenora nodded, tears burning her eyes. I wasn't allowed to see her anymore. They said it would confuse her. Grant slammed his hand onto the desk. The sound echoed through the room. They erased you, he said. And they erased me. The woman closed the folder. What matters now is what we can prove. There's evidence of deliberate obstruction, of financial incentives tied to compliance. Grant inhaled slowly, forcing himself back into control. Who benefited? She met his gaze. Your company. In the short term. Lenora felt sick. Grant straightened. Then we dig. Everything. Emails. Internal memos. Payment trails. There's a risk, the woman warned. This won't stay private. I don't care, he said. Not anymore. Lenora watched him, seeing the shift clearly now. This wasn't just grief driving him. It was resolve. There's one last thing, the woman said, hesitating. Grant turned. What? She didn't pass away where you think she did. The room seemed to tilt. What do you mean? Grant asked slowly. The woman slid a single document across the desk. The final transfer wasn't to the facility listed in your records. Lenora stared at the paper, her heart pounding. Grant picked it up, eyes scanning, then freezing. Then where was she? He whispered. The woman didn't answer immediately. She looked at Lenora, and then back at Grant. That, she said quietly, is what we're about to find out. Grant didn't remember sitting down, but suddenly he was in the chair, the document still clutched in his hand. His eyes traced the lines again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. They didn't. This isn't possible, he said quietly. Not denial. Calculation. I was told where she was. I was given reports. Updates. You were given summaries, the woman replied. Filtered ones. Lenora stood frozen beside the desk. Her ears rang. The room felt distant, like she was underwater. I visited that facility, she said slowly. I brought her books there. I remember the hallway. The smell. The woman nodded. She was there. At first. Grant's head snapped up. At first? There was a transfer, she said. One that wasn't properly disclosed. It happened after her condition worsened. Lenora's hands began to shake. Why would they move her? The woman hesitated. That hesitation told them more than the words ever could. Because long-term pediatric care is expensive, she said. And because someone argued that the prognosis didn't justify the cost. Grant stood so abruptly the chair scraped loudly across the floor. They put a price on my daughter's life? They framed it as resource management, the woman said carefully. Not morality. Grant turned away, pressing both palms against the desk, shoulders rigid. For a moment, Lenora thought he might break something. Or himself. When? He asked, voice low and dangerous. 6 months before she passed, the woman answered. Lenora's knees nearly gave out. 6 months. That meant. I was there, she whispered. I was still visiting then. I stopped seeing her after they told me I wasn't helping anymore. The woman met her eyes. Because by then she was already gone from that facility. Lenora covered her mouth, a sob escaping despite her effort to stay quiet. Images flooded back, calls not returned, visits rescheduled, vague explanations. She had blamed herself. Thought she had failed the child by not pushing harder. Grant turned back slowly. His face had changed. The grief was still there, but now it was sharpened into something else. Something colder. Where was she transferred? He asked. The woman opened her folder again, flipping to a tab she hadn't shown them yet. Officially? A specialized care residence out of state. Officially, Grant repeated. Unofficially, she said, there are gaps. Missing daily logs. No consistent attending physician listed. Lenora's voice trembled. So, she was alone? The woman didn't answer immediately. Grant's eyes burned. Answer her. No, she said softly. She wasn't alone. But she wasn't with anyone who knew her. Or loved her. The words landed with devastating precision. Grant walked to the window, staring out at the gray afternoon. Cars passed in the distance. People lived their lives. The world had kept moving while his daughter had been quietly displaced, file by file, signature by signature. They thought I wouldn't notice, he said. Or that I'd accept it after the fact. They thought you'd be too busy, the woman replied. And too broken. Lenora wiped her face, forcing herself to speak. Did she ask for him? She asked. Near the end. The woman looked at her, expression guarded. There's a nurse's note, she said. Unfiled. It mentions a child asking when her father was coming. Grant closed his eyes. And? Lenora pressed. And being told he was on his way, the woman said quietly. Lenora's breath hitched. Grant turned back, pain etched into every line of his face. She waited, Lenora whispered. She thought he was coming. Grant's voice was hoarse. I would have. I know, Lenora said, stepping closer without thinking. I know you would have. The woman cleared her throat. There's more, she said. The facility she was transferred to, it shut down shortly after. Grant stiffened. Shut down? Yes. Investigations. Compliance issues. Records sealed. Lenora's heart pounded. So the truth is buried, the woman finished. But not gone. Grant straightened, something resolute settling over him. Then we dig it up. There will be resistance, she warned. People who don't want this revisited. I don't care, he said. I buried my daughter thinking I knew how she spent her last days. I was wrong. Lenora looked at him, seeing not a billionaire now, not an employer, but a father who had been robbed of goodbye. When do we start? She asked. The woman closed the folder. Immediately. But there's one condition. Grant met her gaze. Name it. You'll need to authorize access to sealed records, she said. And once you do, the public may find out what was done in your company's name. Grant didn't hesitate. Let them. The woman nodded. Then there's one place we need to go first. Where? Lenora asked. The woman looked at her, then at Grant. The original intake site, she said. The one that was never supposed to matter. Grant's jaw tightened. And what will we find there? The woman paused, then answered quietly. Someone who remembers. The intake site sat at the edge of a small industrial town, the kind of place people passed without noticing. A squat brick building. Faded signage. A parking lot cracked by time and weather. Grant stopped the car and stared at it through the windshield, his hands still on the steering wheel long after the engine had gone quiet. This is where it started, he said. Lenora sat beside him, her coat pulled tight around her. Her chest felt hollow. She had driven past places like this before, never imagining one of them had quietly redirected the life of a child she loved. The woman from the firm, Miss Calder, was already waiting by the door. She nodded once, businesslike, then buzzed them in. Inside, the building smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The hallway floors were scuffed, the walls lined with outdated posters about patient rights and intake procedures. Everything felt paused in time. A receptionist glanced up, startled. Can I help you? Miss Calder showed her credentials. We're here regarding a former intake. Pediatric transfer. Several years ago. The receptionist hesitated. Those records are archived. I know, Miss Calder replied calmly. We'd like to speak to someone who was on duty at the time. Pause. Then, reluctantly, the receptionist picked up the phone. They waited in silence. Grant paced. Lenora stood still, her hands clasped together so tightly her fingers ached. Finally, a door opened down the hall. An older woman stepped out, her gray hair pulled back, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her eyes moved from Miss Calder to Grant, then stopped on Lenora. Her face changed. Oh, she said softly. It's you. Lenora's breath caught. You remember me? The woman nodded slowly. Of course I do. You were the one who stayed late. You sat with her when she cried. Grant turned sharply. You knew my daughter. The woman looked at him fully now. Yes, she said. I did. They were led into a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. The woman, she introduced herself as Ellen, sat across from them, folding her hands. I wasn't supposed to talk about it, Ellen said. We were told to follow procedure. To trust the transfers. Grant leaned forward. Tell us anyway. Ellen looked at Lenora again. She asked about you, she said quietly. She said the lady who sang to her hadn't come back. Lenora closed her eyes. Her knees trembled. They moved her fast, Ellen continued. No goodbyes. No transition. One day she was here. The next gone. Grant's voice was tight. Who ordered it? Ellen shook her head. I never saw a name. Just pressure. Calls. Emails flagged urgent. Did you ever see her again? Lenora asked. Ellen hesitated. Once. Weeks later. She was back briefly. Different chart. Different unit. Grant's heart slammed. Back here? Yes, Ellen said. She was weaker. Quieter. She asked me if she had done something wrong. The room felt like it was closing in. What did you tell her? Lenora whispered. I told her no, Ellen said, eyes shining. That grown-ups sometimes make mistakes. Grant stood abruptly, turning away, his breath ragged. He pressed his forehead against the wall, shoulders shaking once before he caught himself. Miss Calder broke the silence. Why wasn't this logged? Ellen looked down. Because the facility she was sent to called it a final placement. They said no one needed confusion. Grant turned back slowly. Final, he repeated. Ellen nodded. When I heard later that she passed, I knew something had been wrong. Why didn't you speak up? Lenora asked, not accusing, just broken. Ellen met her eyes. Because I was afraid. And because people like me don't fight people like him. Grant stiffened. Like who? Ellen hesitated, then said the name. Grant went very still. That's impossible, he said. He worked for me. Miss Calder's expression hardened. Not just worked for you, she said. He managed risk. The words settled with chilling clarity. Grant laughed once, bitter and hollow. Risk, he said. My daughter was risk. Lenora felt dizzy. The second twist was forming now, its shape unmistakable. This hadn't been neglect. It had been strategy. Miss Calder closed her notebook. We have enough, she said quietly. Enough to reopen everything. Grant looked at Lenora. In his eyes was guilt, fury, and something like apology that words could never fix. She trusted us, Lenora said softly. Grant nodded. And we failed her. Ellen stood. There's one more thing, she said. Before she was moved the last time, she left something. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn envelope. She asked me to keep it safe, Ellen said. She said it was for her father. Grant took it with shaking hands. He didn't open it yet, because suddenly he was afraid of what his daughter might have known, and what she might have forgiven him for. Grant held the envelope as if it weighed more than paper and ink. His fingers trembled, and for a moment, Lenora thought he might drop it. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint ticking of a wall clock. Ellen and Miss Calder gave him space, understanding that this was no longer about documents or investigations. It was about something far more intimate. "Open it," Lenora said softly, her voice careful. She didn't reach for it. That wasn't her place. This was his. Grant's hands fumbled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside there was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, and a small drawing. The paper was wrinkled, creased from being handled over and over. He unfolded it slowly, heart hammering. The drawing was simple. A child's sketch of a house, a garden, and a smiling stick-figure man holding a girl's hand. Beneath it, in small, careful handwriting, were words that made his throat constrict. "Daddy, I love you. I'm not mad. I know you were busy. I forgive you. Please come for me soon. Grant stared at the note, unable to speak. His vision blurred, but this wasn't grief. It was shock, disbelief, and a sudden, overwhelming mixture of regret and relief. Lenora felt tears prick her own eyes, though she fought to stay composed. She had expected anger, sorrow, but forgiveness? The child's words were like a key sliding into a locked door in his chest, and everything inside shifted. She wrote this?" he asked finally, voice barely audible. "Yes," Ellen said softly. "The night before she was transferred. She told me she wanted you to have it when the time was right." Grant's hands shook violently as he held the paper closer, staring at it like he might lose it if he blinked. "She forgave me," he whispered. She forgave me before I could even say I was sorry." Lenora's own voice broke through the weight of the moment. "That's why she trusted you," she said softly. "Even when they moved her. Even when she was scared." Grant's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, there was no wall between them. Not the cold billionaire armor, not the grief that had hollowed him out. Just a raw, open ache, and a desperate hope he hadn't dared to feel. "She wanted me to come for her," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "She knew I would, someday." The office felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of secrets finally uncovered. But within that pressure there was clarity. For the first time, Grant could see the path he had been denied, the life he had almost missed. And Lenora realized something too. She was no longer just an observer of grief. She had been a guardian, a witness, and now, a bridge between the past and what could still be salvaged. Miss Calder cleared her throat gently. "We need to verify the final location," she said. "Everything else hinges on that." Grant nodded, finally setting the envelope down. He turned to Lenora. "I don't care what it takes. I will go anywhere. Find anyone. I will know the truth." Lenora met his gaze. "Then we go together," she said. "You won't have to face it alone." He nodded again, fists tightening. "Not alone." The room seemed to hold its breath as Grant slid the envelope carefully into his coat pocket. Outside, rain had started again, heavier this time, drumming against the roof like a countdown. Every drop felt urgent, a reminder that time had been stolen from him, but it could still be reclaimed. As they stepped out of the building, Grant's mind was already racing. Who had moved her? Why hadn't anyone told him? And most importantly, could he still reach her in time? But the next revelation would hit harder than any paperwork or testimony. And it would come from someone he had trusted completely, someone whose betrayal cut closer than he had ever imagined. Because not every secret had surfaced yet. And some truths he would soon learn could shatter even the strongest hearts. The car ride back to the city was tense, silent except for the soft swish of tires on wet pavement. Grant gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, the envelope still tucked safely in his coat pocket. Lenora sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was racing. She could feel the shift in him, the mixture of grief, rage, and determination that no words could soothe. When they arrived at the estate, the house felt different. Empty, silent, waiting. Grant didn't stop the car in the driveway. Instead, he drove straight to the office, a place where he had conducted business, made decisions, and now, perhaps, faced the most personal reckoning of his life. Miss Calder was already there, organizing files and cross-referencing records. "We need access to the internal communications," she said, voice calm, clinical. "Emails, memos, and personnel notes related to your daughter's care." Grant nodded, moving toward his desk. He reached for his laptop, fingers hesitating over the keys. Something in his gut told him this wouldn't just uncover administrative errors, it would expose motives. Lenora stepped closer, sensing the same unease. "Grant?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the screen, scrolling through messages, approvals, and transfers. Then a single name appeared, repeated across multiple threads, marked with urgency. Elaine Harper. Lenora stiffened. "That's one of your senior executives," she said quietly. Grant's chest tightened. "Yes," he said slowly, voice low. "She's been with the company for over a decade. Trusted. Loyal. The one person I never doubted." But now doubt had arrived, sharp and cutting. He clicked through her emails, reading lines that made his blood run cold. Instructions to delay communication. Notes approving transfers without informing him. Recommendations to limit parental access. Every careful move, every justification bore her signature, or worse, her implicit approval. Lenora placed a hand lightly on his arm. "She could have had reasons," she said softly. "Maybe she thought she was protecting you." Grant shook his head, barely perceptible. "Protecting me? From what? The truth? From my own daughter?" He scrolled further, finding an email chain dated 6 months before his daughter's final transfer. Elaine's voice was clinical, detached. She wrote about efficiency, cost, and the necessity of keeping the father uninformed to prevent emotional interference. Lenora's eyes widened. She deliberately kept you from her." Grant's jaw clenched. "She orchestrated everything." The weight of betrayal hit him harder than grief itself. A person he had trusted implicitly, someone he considered family, had decided unilaterally what his daughter could and could not have. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the office. "She played God," he whispered, voice shaking with fury. "And I didn't see it." Lenora squeezed his arm gently. "We'll fix it," she said. "We'll uncover everything, and she can't hide it forever." Grant shook his head, the rage and grief mixing into a storm he could barely control. "It's not just about hiding it," he said. "She thought she could control it. Control me. Control my daughter's life. And nearly succeeded." Lenora swallowed. "But she didn't. She underestimated us." Grant's eyes met hers, sharp and burning. "Underestimated me? Perhaps. But more importantly, underestimated her daughter." The room seemed to constrict, the air electric with the tension of revelation. Grant's hand shook slightly as he opened the laptop again. Emails, messages, and notes sprawled across the screen like breadcrumbs leading directly to Elaine Harper's calculated choices. Then a single line in one email made his stomach drop. Asterisk. If he ever finds out, damage control will be required. Lenora has proven useful. Ensure she remains compliant and unaware of full details. Asterisk. Lenora froze. Her eyes went wide. They manipulated me too? Grant nodded slowly, voice barely audible. She used you. You were part of their plan without knowing it. Shock, hurt, and anger coursed through Lenora. I thought I was helping her," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting your daughter." "You were," Grant said, taking her hands in his. "You were protecting her emotionally in ways they never could. That's why they needed you unaware. But now, the plan ends." Lenora exhaled shakily, the weight of guilt and relief mingling in her chest. She had been manipulated, yes, but she had done everything with love, and that love had kept the memory of the little girl alive in ways that no corporate calculation could ever erase. Grant stood resolute now. "We confront her," he said, voice low, dangerous. "And this ends once and for all. Lenora nodded. Together. The storm outside had begun to rage again, rain hammering the roof like a drumbeat counting down the final confrontation. And somewhere deep inside, both of them understood that nothing would ever feel safe or ordinary again. Because betrayal had been revealed, and now vengeance, truth, and reckoning were unstoppable. The second major plot twist had fully emerged. Elaine Harper, Grant's most trusted executive, had orchestrated the silencing, transfers, and concealment of his daughter's final months, manipulating even Lenora to achieve her plan. But the question now remained, how far would Grant go to reclaim justice, and would Elaine pay the price for what she had done? Grant didn't sleep that night. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside the Holloway estate, rain thrashing against the windows as if urging him toward action. He sat in the office, the envelope still tucked safely in his coat pocket, and reviewed the evidence again. Elaine Harper's emails, memos, and notes detailing every calculated move she had made to keep him from his daughter. Every time he read her name, a wave of disbelief and fury rolled over him. Lenora sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had replayed the email line over and over in her mind, the one that revealed she had been used as a pawn. And yet, despite the betrayal, she knew that her role had been real, that the love and care she had given the little girl were untouched by Elaine's manipulations. When morning came, Grant called a meeting with Elaine. She arrived promptly as always, dressed in her impeccable suit and carrying the air of confidence she had cultivated over a decade in the company. But this time, something in the room was different. She could feel it. She could sense the tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Elaine," Grant said, standing with his hands on the desk, voice cold and controlled, "we need to talk." Elaine gave a small, polite smile. "Of course, Grant. I assume this is about the adoption files." "Yes," he said flatly. "And about what you did to my daughter, to Lenora, and to me." Her smile faltered slightly. "I was only following procedure," she said smoothly. "Following procedure?" Grant's voice rose, anger threading through the words. "You kept me in the dark. You moved my daughter without my knowledge. You ensured I couldn't see her. And you used Lenora to do it. You call that procedure?" Elaine's jaw tightened. "I did what I thought was best," she said, her voice still calm but the slightest tremor betraying her. Grant's eyes blazed. "Best? You calculated every step to suit your convenience, to protect your career. And now I know the full extent of your manipulation. Every email, every memo, every so-called recommendation, it was all you." Lenora stepped forward, her voice steady despite the rage and hurt that burned in her chest. "You underestimated how much a child can sense love, and how much one loyal heart can protect her, even when you think you control everything." Elaine blinked, clearly shaken by Lenora's words. She had never imagined that the quiet, obedient maid would confront her with such authority. Grant walked around the desk slowly, each step deliberate, eyes never leaving hers. "You almost destroyed everything that mattered. And for what? Efficiency? Control? Money?" Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it. No explanation could justify what she had done. Grant leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper filled with quiet fury. "You forgot one thing. She trusted me. And even when you tried to silence me, tried to erase my presence from her life, she held on. And I found her. I have her message. She forgave me. And I am not letting her memory, or her life, be erased by your selfishness." Elaine's composure broke. Her eyes widened, the carefully crafted mask slipping. She knew she had lost, not because of law or protocol, but because love and truth were more powerful than any chain of authority she had tried to wield. Grant turned to Lenora. "We finish this together. She doesn't get another chance to manipulate anyone." Elaine swallowed hard. "What will you do?" she asked, fear finally overtaking her pride. Grant's eyes were icy. "Justice," he said simply, "and transparency. Everything you've done will be exposed. Everyone will know." Lenora nodded beside him. And we'll make sure nothing like this happens again. Elaine's shoulders slumped, the fight gone. For the first time she was vulnerable, stripped of the power she had wielded for so long. Grant looked down at the envelope in his coat pocket and then back at her. You almost made me too late, he said. But I'm here. And she would have wanted me to fight for her. Elaine swallowed again, then nodded slightly resigned. She had lost not just the battle but the moral high ground she had never truly had. As Grant and Lenora left the office, the storm had passed. Rain shimmered on the driveways, washing the world clean, as if reflecting the clarity and resolve that had finally settled over them. For the first time in months they could breathe. But the weight of the past, the hidden months, the manipulations, the stolen moments, would always be a part of their story. Grant looked at Lenora, his expression softening for the first time since the investigation began. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying, for fighting, for loving her when I couldn't. Lenora shook her head, smiling faintly through her tears. She loved you, Grant, and she'd want you to live, not just survive. He nodded, and together they stepped into the sunlight, ready to honor her memory, reclaim her story, and finally begin to heal. The estate was quiet that evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glimmering under the soft glow of streetlights. Grant and Lenora stood together on the balcony, overlooking the gardens that had been so full of laughter once, now empty, but not lifeless. Grant held the envelope in his hand, the child's message pressed gently inside his coat pocket. He traced the folded edges with his thumb, feeling the weight of words written years ago yet alive with meaning. For months he had carried anger, guilt, and grief like armor. Now he felt something else, peace, fragile but undeniable. Lenora stood beside him, silent, as if giving him space to feel it fully. After everything, the manipulation, the hidden transfers, the betrayal, there was clarity. They had uncovered the truth, confronted the people responsible, and honored the memory of the little girl who had trusted them both so completely. Grant exhaled, the sound shaky but steadying. I can't believe it's finally over, he said softly. I thought I had failed her completely. You didn't, Lenora said. Her voice was quiet but firm. You found her. You saw her message. She forgave you. And she loved you. That's what matters. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. Not as an employee, not as someone who had simply cared for his daughter, but as a person who had been unwaveringly loyal, who had protected the heart of the child he had lost. His chest tightened with gratitude he couldn't fully express. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You don't need to, she replied. You're living her memory. That's thanks enough. They stayed in silence for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. Then, almost instinctively, Grant reached out, taking her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with his, a small but profound gesture of trust and shared experience. I'll never forget her, he said. Or what she taught me, about love, about patience, about noticing the small things that matter most. Lenora smiled faintly, tears glinting in her eyes. And she'll never forget you either. Even in those final months, she carried your love with her. Grant pressed the envelope against his chest. I wish I could have been there more. I wish, his voice faltered, but Lenora squeezed his hand reassuringly. You were there in the ways that counted, she said. She felt it. She always did. They stayed like that for a while longer, two people who had weathered grief, betrayal, and fear, now standing together with a sense of fragile hope. There was still healing to do for both of them, but they were ready. Together. Grant turned toward the house, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow, he said softly, we'll make sure her story is told properly. The truth, the way it should have been known all along. Lenora nodded. And we'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again. He smiled faintly, a quiet, genuine smile that hadn't touched his face for months. I think she would have liked that. Lenora laughed softly, a sound that was warm and real. She would have loved it. They lingered on the balcony a little longer, letting the night settle around them. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled them. And in that moment, Grant felt a sense of connection he hadn't known since the little girl's laughter had filled the house. As they finally turned to go inside, Lenora glanced at him, a question in her eyes. Grant shook his head with a faint, understanding smile. "No words needed," he said. And together they walked into the house, carrying her memory, their resolve, and the quiet, unspoken promise to honor the life they had both loved so fiercely. Outside, the wind stirred gently, whispering through the trees. The world had shifted. A chapter had closed. And though the grief would always remain, so too would the love, the forgiveness, and the bond forged in loss and loyalty, a bond that neither time nor betrayal could ever sever. Grant finally felt it, a heart unburdened, ready to heal, ready to live. And somewhere, somehow, he knew she was smiling.